Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me speak today. I first of all want to say that I have never seen or heard in person a Sloane's froglet, and I was hoping that this event would allow me to come for the very first time, probably a little while ago, and see these guys in person. But alas, I'm going to miss out in this time. I have, however, heard a lot of Sloane's froglets, thanks to everybody out there submitting calls of them to the FrogID project. So I've had to steal this photo from my colleague Steve and Marnie, but one day I hope to see this amazing little frog myself. So I'm going to start, I guess, a bit of the why FrogID, and then talk a little bit about FrogID and some of the things that we're finding thanks to people out there like yourself. And I must say that you guys are particularly my, I guess, my source of inspiration when I say that people are willing to stand out in the freezing cold in a swamp at night to record frogs. I'm thinking of you in particular, because I know it's awfully cold when Sloane's froglet are calling. But overall, frogs are in a lot of trouble, and that's the reason that we created FrogID, or one of the main reasons. So in Australia, we have at the moment 243 native species of frog. So in any one place, you might get 3 or 4 species, particularly in the drier areas, up to potentially, if you were a superhero and went all night, you might be able to get 30 or more species in one night. So quite a diversity of frogs adapted to rainforest, to desert, and there's a lot of good frogs in your area, but they are in trouble. So we've already lost at least 4 species of frogs in Australia to extinction, and several others are missing, feared extinct. And we have many more, about 36 species that are kind of perched on the edge of extinction. So it's not great for frogs. Australia has a pretty bad track record, but globally, I guess we're not alone. So frogs on a global scale are also incredibly threatened. So about 42% of all frog species that are known, or all amphibian, including frog species, are threatened with extinction. So they're in a heck of a lot of trouble. But I guess the big question is, I guess, so what? Well, frogs are important for ecosystems. We should care about them because they are fantastic indicators of ecosystem health. So frogs are very sensitive to any kind of environmental change. So when things are out of sync, then they start to disappear. So if we monitor our frogs, we can actually get a decent indication of environmental health as well. They're also incredibly important in food webs and energy flows. So even though frogs themselves are tiny, their biomass can be the biggest in many ecosystems. So if you were to make a pile of all the frogs, a pile of all the reptiles, birds, mammals, these hypothetical piles in your mind, in many ecosystems, the frog pile would actually be the biggest pile of all the vertebrates. And so therefore, it's not surprising, you know, they're eating tons of invertebrate species, including pests. The tadpoles are eating algae, helping keep our waterways clear. And they're also eaten by a lot of things. So frogs help support birds, mammals, reptiles. And so they're a really, really important part of the ecosystem. And in places where we've lost frogs, which unfortunately globally we have nearly lost frogs from some places, nothing else steps up and fills the role of frogs. So we need them, definitely. Now, there are some more selfish reasons we might want frogs. So each frog has kind of a chemical cocktail on its skin, and they use these to stop them from getting infected by all sorts of diseases. And increasingly, we are investigating frogs for our own human medicine. So antivirals, antibacterials, antifungals, even contraceptives and drug delivery is all coming out of frogs. And so when we lose a species of frog, we lose the potential to maybe save ourselves down the track. And almost all of Australia's frog species are found nowhere else in the world. And crazily, we still don't even know how many species of frog we have in Australia. So there's likely to be another 2 or 3 species described and officially named in Australia this year alone. So it's crazy. Our frogs are in trouble. We don't know much about them. And even for the species that we do know, as you all know, we have a very poor understanding of them. So one of the biggest obstacles we face, aside from the obvious huge threats, disease, habitat loss, climate change, is that we actually don't know much about them. So when we're trying to decide what we need to do, often it's based upon best guesses. This map in the background is actually a map of all the records of frogs. And this was, I actually took this screen cap before FrogID, so it's better now. But this is from the Atlas of Living Australia from New South Wales. You can sort of see Sydney, Wollongong. And these are the official records of frogs in Australia. And one of the things that I was noticing at the time was there are hundreds of kilometres of Australia with no official frog records at all. And so when it comes to planning the next national park or where a development should be, frogs aren't being considered in conservation decisions. So the other cool thing about frogs that helps us get by this is the fact that each frog species has a different call. And these are two species of frogs. They're stream frogs from Eastern Australia, Litoria barringtonensis and Litoria philocroa. And they look very, very similar, so similar that sometimes I'm not able to tell them apart visually in the field by looking at these frogs. The differences are incredibly subtle. But by actually listening to their calls, you don't even have to see the frog. You don't have to kind of get in a swamp, disturb the habitat. I mean, you certainly don't want to touch the frog because you might, transmit diseases, but their calls are as different as day and night. And it makes sense because frogs don't want to waste their time getting the wrong species. They want to make sure they get the right species. So they all have different calls. And the thing that enables these calls to be so useful in monitoring is the fact that we're all carrying around this amazing piece of technology these days that lets us do all this data collection with very little effort. And that's why FrogID was created. So it's a national citizen science project. It's all based around a free app for your smartphone. It does have a field guide with photos and calls, and it is the most up-to-date field guide. So we also know the species that are coming up to be described, and as soon as they are, we will update the app so that you'll always have the latest information. We're also looking to update with more fun facts about species. So hopefully we can jazz up the Sloane's Froglet account. So if anyone has any advice on what you would like in there, we can jazz that up. We also often include calls that have been submitted. We add them to the species profile so that you'll be able to listen to your call and other people will be able to listen to your call as well. But the main reason we have FrogID is a tool so that you can record and submit the calls of frogs. It's not yet a Shazam. So every single submission is identified by one or more frog experts based at the Australian Museum. So it's really simple. You just listen out for a frog, you hear it, and you do the kind of crazy FrogID pose. So yeah, press record for 20 to 60 seconds. So just hit the big red button. You've got to do at least 20 seconds or it'll start all over again. And then you can basically just sort of press submit, submit, submit if you want. You don't have to enter things, but you can add notes, you can add photographs, you can tell us the kind of habitat the frog was in. And then once you submit that, it gets submitted to the FrogID database where somebody like myself, which is an illustration of me but with glasses on in there, we can see absolutely everything. So we can listen to the call. This is one of my submissions of a red-backed toadlet. So you can listen to the call, you can see exactly on a map where it is. It's got the latitude, the longitude, and also a measure of accuracy. So the phone, even this gorge, I had no mobile reception and I was down a gorge that there was no frog records at all that existed in this gorge, but my phone still knew where it was to six meters, which is pretty good. I didn't submit any photos, but I did tell FrogID that it was in a natural area and in a stream and a creek. I had no notes. And then somebody's gone and identified that as what I said it was, which was a red-backed toadlet. So it's super easy. And, if there's any queries in the future of, oh, really was that, we can go back and listen to it again. So it's a lot like a museum voucher where you have that kind of recording of the frog that you can go back and listen to. So it's made as easy as possible. I mean, I always struggle with the I really want to learn birds. But a lot of the sort of eBird data, I'm like, I just don't know what that is. I can add kookaburras and magpies, but then tiny brown birds, I'm out. So we make FrogID easy. You don't need to know what it is. We'll take care of that for you. But it is nice when you do tick the frogs. So we've been going for almost 4 years. When we launched FrogID, I didn't know if it would just be, my grandmother and my best friend that would end up using it. And I've been blown away by how many people have taken up FrogID and submitted frog records. So we've had hundreds of thousands of people download FrogID, but we've had about 25,000 people actually submit an audio recording, which is pretty fantastic. We've had 277,000 or so submissions as of today, which has resulted in about 440,000 records of frogs. So not all submissions have frogs in them. We get a lot of crickets and insects, and that's fine because they often are really hard to tell apart. But then other submissions, of course, have heaps of frogs. And I think maximum number of species calling in a recording so far still is 12. So a single recording might result in 12 records. And so far we've got 204 species. You can see it is a bit of a population map of Australia, and that's part of citizen science. So our aim is to fill those gaps as well. So if you sort of divided Australia into half a decimal degree grids, we've only got 30% of Australia covered with frogs, and we need to get all of Australia covered with frogs. So that's definitely an aim for the future. But it is remarkable. So in less than 4 years, and we're more than 75% now, so we're approaching, and we'll probably pretty much get there, doubling the number of frog records that exist in Australia in the last 240 years. And these ones all come with a latitude or longitude. You can listen to the frog calls again. And so it is a remarkable achievement. And that is thanks to people like you, which is amazing. So FrogID is increasing. Then this is the number of records since launch. You can see that there is a very seasonal sort of up and down. For the most of the East Coast, it might have a little bit to do with people not wanting to go out in the cold, but except for this group of people. But certainly that most frog species along the East Coast breed in summer. I guess the opposite is true in Perth. We tend to get more recordings in winter, but for Australia as a whole, we definitely get more and more recordings in summer. And you can see signatures of drought and fire on there. So you can see in late 2020, all the calls started going down. Everyone was reporting that no frogs were calling. In February, that was 2019. In February last year, it rained and we got a lot of recordings. And it was kind of insane how many recordings we got in FrogID week in November last year. And we're hoping to beat that this year. The number of species, not surprisingly, there was a really sharp increase at the start as everyone got all the common species, but we've hit a little bit of a plateau. A lot of the species that we still have to get via FrogID occur in really remote areas, might call only when it rains, which might be really unpredictable and infrequent. And unfortunately, of course, some of these species are extinct and we're actually unlikely to ever hear the call again, which is awful. But FrogID, all this data, what does it do? What are we using it for? What has it revealed? Aside from, understanding the distribution of a species and understanding sort of when frogs breed, we're looking at it, and I use the we as in the scientific community, but particularly the Australian Museum, using it to address questions like climate change, drought and fire. So we didn't actually realise how important FrogID would be for understanding the impacts of the 2019-2020 bushfires on Australia's frogs. I watched it on the news. I watched these fires. I obviously breathe in the air. I didn't think that the frogs would be able to survive. I was absolutely horrified. I didn't know what would happen to all my field sites. I managed to just about get into the field, and then as soon as that happened, COVID restrictions came down on us, and so there was this massive fear of how are we going to understand the impacts of this fire if we can't get out there. And even though scientists, for the most part, couldn't get out there and study the impacts of these fires on frogs, everybody across the fire zone recorded hundreds of frog calls. And we were able to use this data to provide, I think, one of the first, if not the first, sort of data-based papers on the impacts of the fires on Australia's frogs, or any kind of biodiversity, which is all thanks to people out there recording frogs in their backyard. And it was a really good news picture, so that revealed widespread short-term persistence of Australia's frogs. And sort of going out into the field afterwards, certainly not for all frogs, and we do not know the long-term implications of these fires, but I've also seen at some of my field sites more frogs than I'd seen in a fair while, which is pretty amazing. So my fingers are crossed that this good news continues, and we're working on another paper using FrogID to look at the longer term situation. And so it gives me a lot of hope that frogs can be really resilient. And of course, frogs have dealt with drought and fires in the past. It's just the scale of this and then everything else that's going on that's likely to, I guess, tip them over the edge. But it's all thanks to citizen science that we know about this, everyone out there recording on their phone. We're also examining the impacts of land use change, and a couple of papers that came out in the last year or so, for example, used FrogID data to find that 70% of the frog species that we had enough data from FrogID for were actually intolerant of human modified habitats. So they were less likely to be found the more the habitat was modified, which I guess is somewhat intuitive, but 70% is pretty hideous. And a lot of the other species that we didn't have enough data for are probably even more intolerant. We also found that if you just looked at kind of the urban areas, the cities, that the number of frog species in our cities was less than half that of adjacent natural areas. So although this sounds horrifying, we're now working to look to see, okay, what do we need to do in our urban areas? How can we create more frog-friendly habitats? And that's thanks to all these recordings coming in. FrogID has also revealed disappearing frogs. So one of the first findings, because of the volume of submissions from Sydney that we found, was that there was a stark absence of the green tree frog, which used to be really common throughout Sydney. And that's now missing from most of Sydney, occasional record here and there. And so we're looking into what we can do about that. And more recently, the magnificent brood frog, which occurs up on the Atherton Tablelands in North Queensland, a local community group, very much like the Sloan's Champions, is actually using FrogID as a tool to re-monitor survey sites. So sites that the frog was known at the past, because it's facing an increasing challenge from development from wind farms that are impacting its habitat. So the FrogID data is actually, thanks to the people that are recording the frogs, the best data that we have now. And this data has been provided in advance to the Queensland government so they can fully consider the impacts of these wind farms. FrogID is providing us amazing information on how the cane toad is moving, and hopefully will help us understand what kind of impact it's actually having on frogs. It doesn't seem to have the horrible impact we thought that it would do on frogs, but FrogID is helping understand both the kind of invasion edges and also helping detect when a cane toad is accidentally transported outside of its sort of normal range, or the range that's moving itself, by hitchhiking. And we'll hopefully be able to detect any incursions from other frog species, including the black spine toad from Asia, which is often intercepted at our borders. So we're keeping our ears out for things that might be a big concern. And something that I wasn't really thinking was a huge thing until FrogID, and is very relevant in this situation, is certainly that we're finding a lot of native species far outside their native ranges. And so hitchhiking and establishing populations, whether they're on produce, whether we assume they're accidental introductions, but certainly the graceful tree frog is kicking off in Sydney now. So that's, yeah, very interesting finding. And so we can investigate what's going on with these guys. And of most importance, we are finding that the dwarf tree frog is actually expanding dramatically. So before FrogID, it was known from some populations around Melbourne and sort of into northern Victoria. But since then, obviously, it's expanded into the Albury region. We're also detecting populations throughout Canberra. And one of the interesting things is that there's sort of a bit of an absence of legislation or of an understanding of what to do, because it's a native species. What do you do? But FrogID and everyone out there using FrogID is helping us understand what's going on, and we're working with governments to try and figure out what to do. FrogID is also being used in species discovery. So one of Australia's most recently sort of renamed frogs, Spalding's rocket frog, which has been described as, sounds like a chicken pushing a lawnmower. And I encourage you all to listen to this frog call in the FrogID app. But we're also using it to study a whole bunch of other species and potentially end up describing new species in the process. And that's both part of the FrogID team at the Australian Museum, but researchers across Australia asking for the data and using that in their research. And if you want to check out some of the publications from FrogID, you can check out the science page, the links at the bottom there. And that's primarily thanks to a group of amazing students, which for some reason happen to all be female. So the Australian Museum's doing a lot of women-led research using FrogID. So there's at the moment 3 PhD students and 2 honours students that are using exclusively or in part FrogID data to help understand and conserve frogs, which is really fantastic. So hopefully they'll be producing a lot of really important work thanks to all your submissions. And FrogID, we provide annual exports to the Atlas of Living Australia, which is coming up next month, and to all the state wildlife atlases. And it's also being incorporated into government recommendations for monitoring and also into many of the federal conservation assessments, which is really fantastic. So we are getting people and particularly environmental consultants using FrogID to monitor, so noting that it's for a BAM assessment, which is great. But back to this little guy, which is where we all started. I use the Sloan's Champions and this little frog in a lot of my talks as an example of exactly what we wanted FrogID to do. It's only going to be successful from the ground up. We can create an app all we want, but if it's not owned by and used by the community and used for conservation, which is exactly what's happening with this project, and that's thanks to Helen and Dave and Glenn and everybody involved, you know, it's just amazing, and we thank you. You're making a real contribution to understanding a tiny little frog that looks almost exactly the same as a very common frog and calls in the depths of winter, so you have to stand out at night recording it. But every single contribution is completely noted, and you know, we thank you so much for getting out there, and we hope that it is used to be, you know, the data will be really important in better informing conservation for this tiny little frog. So thank you so much. And not only this frog, but obviously, as Helen was mentioning, all the other frogs that are being recorded at the same time. And as Helen and I've mentioned, one of these frogs obviously is the eastern dwarf tree frog. And so I think we're going to be at a very interesting spring and summer trying to see where these guys are and how they're spreading. So if we look at the records up until recently, so I haven't checked to see if they're calling yet, but I can definitely do that, of this little guy outside the range. So you can see the native range of the species kind of along the coast. We've now got records in the ACT, the records that were in northern Victoria, which have been since the late 90s, early 2000s. They've now kind of expanded up into the Albury region. Melbourne is full of the little guys. And so it really is, I guess, something that we need to really monitor. Last year, we also got a record at Griffith, and we've got some populations out, you know, pretty well outside their known native range, which is potentially really bad news. So even they are a gorgeous frog and they are native. If you just look at the FrogID records over the last kind of 4 summers, you can see that we are getting more. So the records of Latoria phalanx, of the dwarf tree frog, are in black. The other FrogID records are in salmon, I guess is the colour. And so what you can kind of see though is that we are getting a lot more FrogID records. So it's a little bit hard to tease sometimes, like what is just because we're getting more records and what is because they're spreading. But we definitely believe that they are indeed spreading. And this could have some serious implications. So they're now coming into contact with other species that they have never in their previous previous years been in contact with, and one of those is the Sloan's froglet. So it doesn't occur natively where the Sloan's froglet is. So what kind of interactions it might have, potentially disease transmission. These guys seem pretty robust to the amphibian chytrid fungus. You know, I guess we're going to have to find out. So monitoring what is going on is going to be really vital in these coming months. And I guess just on an ending, I want to say how thankful I am for everybody out there that is submitting a recording or telling their friends about FrogID. I think that, you know, Dave and Helen and anyone that's sort of involved in conservation, it can be very depressing watching some of these, you know, species and not knowing what's going on. But the knowledge that you're willing to stand out there in the pouring rain, record frog calls, and we have these army of people that have joined the fight for biodiversity conservation, and that care and that actually contributing really, really important scientific data is absolutely remarkable, and never has this been more important than now. You know, where scientists are mostly stuck, especially the ones based in Sydney, like myself. We can't get out there. We need you to be out there. You know, frogs have faced drought, they've faced fire, and as many of you know, that currently along Eastern Australia in particular, they're facing a mass mortality event. And so we really need your help to understand how our frogs are doing, and we're so thankful for everything that you have done. Thank you so much.